Okay, good afternoon on my behalf also. My name is Antti Leinonen, and I'm the developer and founder of Road to Vostok, which is this upcoming hardcore survival game set in a post-apocalyptic border zone in Finland. The presentation today is called The Hidden Potential of FOSS Game Engines. The FOSS in this context means free and open source game engines, and this presentation is going to hopefully give you some kind of overview whether these FOSS engines are nowadays somewhat comparable to commercial engines like Unity or Unreal, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, how I ported my game from these commercial engines to these FOSS engines. Few things about myself, like mentioned, name Antti Leinonen. I started making games back in 2012, so over 12 years ago, but back then in Finland there was not that big of a hype towards the gaming industry, and I think it's also because self-confidence and a few other reasons that I kind of didn't want to go to this game industry route at the first. So I deviated a little, and my career led me to Finnish Defence Forces. I became an active army lieutenant through Finnish National Defence University. But I still have this idea that I want to become a full-time game developer at one day. So during those military years, I learned basically all the things that a solo game developer would need: 3D modeling, coding, shaders, game engines, and so on. Then 2018, there was kind of this moment of truth, and I decided to resign from my military position and jump into the game industry. And at this point, I already had quite a good knowledge about all game dev related, and I landed a job as a visual game design teacher. During those teaching years, I basically taught all those same things: 3D modeling, shaders, game engines, and in total, I think I taught over 200 game dev students in Tampere, Finland, and was part of over 150 student game projects in terms of mentoring them and so on. But then, once again, a moment of truth. A few years ago, I decided that I will again resign from my current job position, which was teaching job, and became a full-time game entrepreneur for this game called Road to Vostok. In total, 12 years of game development so far. This presentation is divided into basically three phases. First, I'm going to talk a few things about Road to Vostok, what it is. It's kind of linked to this FOSS story in terms of how complex the project is and how that is linked to the FOSS engines. Then few stories, backstories about how I found these FOSS engines, and then the third and probably the most important part is that is there this hidden potential in those FOSS engines. Let's start with Road to Vostok. Basically, like mentioned, it's made by me, almost 95%. I do use some contractors nowadays, but it's a solo project. It's a hardcore single-player survival game set in this post-apocalyptic border zone in Finland. It's a first-person shooter game. Like mentioned, it's pretty hardcore. Its main idea is basically that you have two different zones called Area 5 and Vostok. Those represent Finland and Russia, and then there is this border zone, and if you go across the border into the Vostok side of things, the game gets permadeath, and if you die in those maps, the game deletes all your save files. So it's not that casual game, I would say. But basically, here's the map of the game world: loot, plan, prepare, make this journey, dangerous journey towards the permanent Vostok zone. There's multiple maps. All maps are based on real Finnish locations in area called Kymenlaakso, which is southern eastern part of Finland. The game looks like this. There's all the typical FPS stuff: weapons, looting, interfaces, UIs, traders, enemies, environments, and so on. And basically, this is the premise when I'm going to talk about FOSS engines, that are those engines capable of supporting this type of games. In terms of production, Road to Vostok is currently at the end of the first production phase, but I started the pre-production already back in 2021 when I was at that teaching job as a visual game design teacher. During those 2021 years. There was research, prototypes, market analysis, and all kinds of small things to prepare myself to that production phase that I'm currently in. The two main things in that production phase was that I initially decided that I'm going to release 2 free demos about the game because the survival game, especially early access survival game market, it has quite a bad stigma nowadays. There has been all kinds of shady projects, so I decided that I'm going to release 3 demos in order to be transparent and provide the players in this genre a chance to get an idea what I'm trying to build. The goal is to go maybe next year, maybe 2026, to early access in Steam, so it's a PC game mostly designed for Steam. In terms of exposure, the project has been received really well. There have been over 700,000 demo players so far for those public demos, and almost 500,000 Steam wishlist, which is really good for a game that is being solo developed with 0 marketing dollars. And also I decided that I'm going to start building the community for the game really early on, already back in pre-production. So the project has a YouTube channel with over 100,000 subscribers and so on. So the exposure so far has been really good, and the potential for that early access release seems pretty good. Okay, then let's jump into this backstory, which is kind of a must-have knowledge for this FOSS topic, and we're going to jump back 12 years ago and go to year 2012. And this is basically the year where all things game dev related started for me. At this point I had 0 knowledge about game development, absolutely 0. No previous game jams, no previous education, absolutely 0. And my initial way of trying to get information about how to make games, I just simply Googled and typed the words how to make video games on YouTube and all the search engines. Basically what I received by typing those keywords was that all paths lead to this game engine called Unity. And that's actually my first game project that I made. The timestamp is somewhere around midnight, April 2012. And basically all that I was able to do is to use some random tree tools and type the name Antti inside Unity. So not much of a game yet. But basically all paths then lead to this tool called Unity. But because I did not have any knowledge about how to make games, I was kind of like wondering whether I can make all game dev related within Unity, or do I need some other tools as well. So I decided to contact people who know things about game development more than I do. So I lived in a city called Hamina, which is located at the same place as the game takes place, and near Hamina there was around 30 kilometers away was this one local game studio which I visited. And during that visitation I asked about this, whether I need any other softwares or tools to make games, and they gave me a yellow post-it note which listed all the tools that I would need to become a successful game developer, or at least skillful game developer. And what that yellow post-it note listed was basically the Autodesk suite, which in game development context means 3ds Max and Maya. The font is kind of small, but if you look at the Autodesk 3ds Max software announced image there, back then the 3ds Max cost little over $3,000 for the standalone version to make 3D models. And since that was one of those listed softwares that I got from the post-it note, I was kind of like depressed, meaning that, okay, my game dev journey ends here because the Autodesk is not going to happen for me. So I had to find something else. And now is the first time that I even hear about this term FOSS. So since the Autodesk is not going to happen for me, I needed to find alternatives that I could use to make 3D models. So after some Googling, I found this free and open source tool called Blender, which is that orange icon. However, at this time, I'm pretty sure that this was a bad advice from the people that I got back then, but I was told that this Blender is going to be a waste of time. meaning it's not industry standard for game development. So once again, a bit depressed, considering that whether I should start saving for that Autodesk tool. But I decided to continue with the Blender and started looking tutorials, all kinds of courses around the Blender, and I quickly actually found out that there's some potential within that tool. Obviously, I call this FOSS potential. It was rough, but really promising, and it seemed that Blender was actually capable of doing a lot of that industry standard stuff, even though the tool wasn't called so-called industry standard. And yes, there was a lot of useful resources that kind of like pushed me towards the Blender, because there was so many beginner-friendly resources to start with. But then, once I figured out that Blender is really cool thing, really cool tool, I started wondering whether I can replace Unity also. But back then, the FOSS game engines, there were basically none for 3D, because I have always been interested about 3D games. So when I researched about whether there's some really promising open source alternatives for Unity, I basically found none. So I decided that fair enough, let's go with these. I cannot replace Unity, but I already got this cool orange thing called Blender. So I'm going to go with these and learn everything that I can with these softwares. So I chose this software combo, Blender and Unity. And now we're going to take a fast travel activated time jump and go 10 years into the past for us, but future for me back then. So during this 10 years, I learned everything that I know or could learn about Unity and Blender. That involved making hundreds of game prototypes, becoming an asset store publisher for Unity, doing freelancer job in the game industry, and building up the required knowledge and skills to become full-time game developer one day. But like mentioned, during those years, there was also that military career path, there was the teaching job, and when we go to year 2022, so the time jump has now happened, I decided to resign from that teaching job, like mentioned. So I took this leap of faith, became a full-time developer, and founded this company that I currently run called Road to Vostok. At this time, 10 years of game development, and most of it was with Unity. I did have some experience with Unreal, I did have some experience with CryEngine, but most of it, probably 99%, was with Unity. Then after, let's just say, few negative events, basically bad decisions after another, in my opinion, because when you're working as a teacher and teaching these softwares like Unity, you have kind of like weird perspective about the tool. You really understand what is useful for the new users, in this case students, and there was multiple events even before that controversial runtime fee thing that kind of like made me question about the decision making that was happening within Unity. So I basically lost trust as a developer towards Unity and started looking once again if there's alternative engines for Road to Vostok. And few disclaimers in this part. Unity is actually doing a lot of good things lately. The path that they are now taking, meaning reverting most of those bad decisions, that's really hopeful, and the promise, the future for Unity looks really bright in multiple sense, but since I lost that trust, it's really hard to go back, so I decided to find another home. If you're interested about this Unity topic more, I have a whole YouTube video solely built for this topic called New Beginning on Road to Vostok YouTube channel. But when I lost the trust, I remember that 10 years ago I found this cool thing called Blender. I was told it's not industry standard, but it became almost industry standard because Blender is nowadays the most used tool in all education related to 3D modeling. It's probably or easily the most the tool that has the most amount of resources, meaning YouTube tutorials, courses, plugins, add-ons, and so on. So the thing that I was told it's not the industry standard is now almost the industry standard for the entire game industry. Of course, there's still all kinds of pipelines integrated with the big game studios, which Autodesk kind of controls, but still I remember that I found this Blender whether there's now a solution to replace Unity with some FOSS engines. Since the Blender was the most trustworthy tool also that I used, meaning it was the most stable, least amount of controversies, so I decided to take another look at these modern day FOSS engines. And compared to 2012, now there was actually options. The options were still quite limited for 3D, but at least there were few ones. There's few that I listed that are the most promising ones, but one of those is beyond the most promising one, and that's called Godot. Some may call it Godot, some may call it Godot. All pronunciations are right. But I decided to look really deeply to Godot. I did initial testing, I tried all kinds of performance profiling, I tried procedural generated environments, I did all the typical stuff that you would do if you're interested about some game engine. And it turned out the Godot engine is actually really suitable for 3D games, even though I was told it's not meant for 3D, it cannot handle 3D. If you're going to switch to Godot, your project is going to fail. And once again, Godot is not going to be the industry standard. So, being a bit stubborn, and since my testing that I did showed me that it can run Road to Vostok, I decided to make a risky decision and port the entire game. At this time, I was already in the production phase, so it definitely was a risky move to port from Unity to Godot. And if you're wondering how this port went, I maintained a diary with this porting journal. I published 3 articles about each phase when I ported the game. The porting was divided into 10 phases. Each of those are still, I think, available in my Patreon, and they're publicly available to read for everyone if you're interested about those. But I divided the port to 10 phases. One of those phases was for example, AI. One of those was, for example, interfaces and UI, and so on. And in total, porting a semi-complex 3D game, FPS type, from Unity, meaning commercial engine, to open source engine took me 615 hours exactly, because I took notes how much time that needed. With my working hours, that's equivalent of 3 months. And like mentioned, I'm a solo developer. I did this port entirely by my own. If there's a team behind, meaning multiple people can handle all the file conversions and porting stuff, then you can really shrink that number down. But for me as a solo developer, it took little over 600 hours. If you're interested about what were the main hurdles if you're ever in a situation that you would consider doing this kind of port decision, there's nothing major that's kind of like really, really time consuming, but there's areas that are semi-time consuming. And one of those areas are if you are going to port your game to an engine that utilizes different scripting language, then of course you have to update all the scripts. Godot has support for C#. I learned through C#, but since that Blender, that orange thing, uses Python as a scripting language, and since the Godot has an option to use Python-like CD script, I decided that I will go full on to that Python-like scripting language, because I have pretty ambitious plans on how I'm going to combine these 2 open source softwares, meaning there's going to be some middlewares and plugins. So when the 2 have similar syntaxes in terms of coding, that's going to be helpful for these ambitious goals. Then, if you're porting your game, you can expect shader errors, a lot of shader errors. Basically, all shaders need to rebuild, and all kinds of value tweaking is needed. Then, animation pipelines. This is pretty nuanced topic, but I had to all the FPS rigs, because it's a first-person shooter game, needed to rebuild. There's different kind of approaches how you need to do AIs, for example, when you're working these FOSS engines. But nevertheless, different animation pipelines. And also one of the things that I find a bit annoying is that I had really good knowledge with Unity what is expensive and what is not in terms of rendering budgets, physics and so on, but I did not have that knowledge with Godot, so it took a lot of analyzing and understanding what is expensive in Godot and what is not. But the conclusion for this port that took that 615 hours is that porting a commercial game project from commercial game engine during production phase to FOSS engine is totally possible. And this FOSS port involves a lot of manual work. There's no magic shortcuts, even though there are so-called importers and conversion tools. No, those don't work in complex games. They might work in simple 2D scenes and games, but if you're trying to port the entire project, those magic shortcuts don't work. I put this image there also because I was awarded in this year's Finnish Game Awards as Creative Achievement of the year 2023, which was related to how I handled this port from Unity to Godot. Okay, now we're going to transition to that actual main part of this presentation, which is that what kind of experiences I have had with working with this open source engine, and maybe what kind of things that you might expect if you ever want to do something similar. First, let's look at the FOSS structure. Let's take Blender and Godot side by side. Typically, these FOSS structures are arranged quite similar way. For example, if you look at the top, there's a foundation on top of Blender and on top of Godot. That's basically the organization that runs, markets, and develops the brand for the FOSS tool. In Godot, that's called Godot Foundation. Blender, that's called Blender Foundation. Then there's contributors, which are the main driving force for getting the new updates, features, and versions for that FOSS tool. And then there's some kind of development fund, which is tied to the foundation and the employees that work in the foundation, all the marketing expenses, expos, and so on. If you look at those numbers, those are driven from the godotengine.org website and blender.org website. All the numbers are not bulletproof, but they're pretty close to realism. But I wanted to showcase these first because I was looking at or searching that Blender of game engines, so the Godot seems quite similar how it operates like Blender. There was also those contributor numbers are tied to the latest release. For example, the latest engine release for Godot was Godot 4.3, and there was around 500 contributors. And for Blender, that was Blender 4.2, and there was 125. Then a few main whys. What are basically the main benefits for FOSS and why you might consider FOSS platforms to begin with. These are kind of the obvious ones, but I will go through them anyways. The first is that you have the source code and the platform control, meaning you can modify anything game engine related and you can use the engine for whatever purpose. Typically, these FOSS engines use something called MIT license, and that's basically the most open license that you can receive in terms of modification and how to use the content and so on. But basically no restrictions. Then the obvious one is also related to costs. There's no engine seats, there's no licensing cost, and there's no royalties. Whether your game makes 1 million, 10 million, 1 billion, it doesn't make a difference because there's no royalties related to FOSS platforms. Everything is free now and forever, and all the content that you create within the engine is yours, and you can decide where you want to use that or not. Then that contributor-based engine development is a huge positive. There's also negatives, but I see that as a positive because when the decision-making is only tied to some corporate or company lead, then that's quite a small bubble. But when you divide the decision-making power to hundreds of contributors, meaning how the engine will get developed, what kind of features are going to get implemented, there's less room for errors, let's just say this. And once you have enough contributors, the progression and development speed can actually exceed any commercial product because you have so many contributors putting time and effort to the same goal. Then the FOSS engines are typically really lightweight. For example, the Godot download is little over 50 megabytes, and there's no a large tech company software bloat, I'm not sure if that's the right word to use, or any unnecessary middlewares. You don't need internet connection, there's just the engine launcher and you're good to go. Okay, let's take a look at some of the nuances. Let's start with the editor. This is from the Godot editor and wrote to Vostok, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with, for example, Unity, but it's really similar. The terms and the phrases are a bit different. For example, in Unity, we have these things called prefabs. In Godot, those are called scenes. In Unity, we have objects. In Godot, we have nodes. But the layout, the ideology, how you operate the editor is really similar with Unity. When I started doing that port, I didn't have to read any tutorials how to use the engine because it naturally seemed familiar to me. Also, the editor UI is quite minimalistic in my way, and I see that as a good thing. Then one of the key things that I was told when doing that, or when I made the porting decision, is that the Godot is not, or the FOSS engines are not designed for 3D, which is kind of weird phrase in my opinion. But those are some of the screenshots from Road to Vostok running on Godot, and in my eye, looking at the old Unity builds and looking at the current Godot builds, I would say they look at least close to each other in terms of 3D graphics and fidelity. Of course, we are not talking about Unreal, there's no Nanite, there's no Lumen, I mean in indirect light bouncing simulations and all that stuff. Or there is actually some of those, but not as good as Unreal. But if you compare, for example, Unity and Godot, they can become quite close to each other in terms of 3D graphics. Here's also, because it's an FPS game, some of the screenshots from the weapon models and basically the player's point of view. And then probably the biggest pain point that people are considering towards these FOSS engines. How about, even though you can make them look quite similar, what about the performance? I have performance profiles from the old Unity builds for Road to Vostok, and I have performance profiles from the current Godot builds. And those are quite the same. They are not directly comparable because the content is totally different. There's new stuff in the Godot, there's different stuff in the Unity, but in terms of how many nature assets, what kind of things are running at the background, for example, AI pathfinding, for example, procedural generation, loot spawning, they are quite similar. But there's few buts. With FOSS engines, meaning Godot, you have to do a lot more manual optimization. Unity does a lot of stuff for you that you don't even pay attention to, but once you start using these FOSS engines, you're kind of like those automation tools are taking some of those away from you. So you have to pay more attention to simplified colliders, draw call reductions, and more attention to stuff like VRAM and so on. Then also there's stuff related to shaders. Godot, for example, now doesn't have a good solution for shader caching that can lead to lag spikes, rubber banding, and so on. But once you implement that custom solution, then it's not a problem. There's few things about AI pathfinding, there's few things about screen space effects, but what I'm trying to say, if you have enough game dev skills, you have the knowledge, you can outcome or at least reduce most of these issues like I did. But the native Godot experience will have some of these issues compared to commercial engines. Then what about 2D and UI? This is quite easy topic because I can pretty honestly say that Godot shines in every way when it comes to 2D and UI elements. There's even a wide range of tools and features that I wish that I had in Unity. So if you're especially interested in 2D games, Godot is a really good option for that. Then what about customization and tooling? I wanted to brought this up because I see Godot as a platform that I can customize and develop for my own purposes, and in the future I might develop that into something called Vostok engine, which involves a lot of custom stuff. I want to hire engine programmers to build that platform, but I don't have those resources yet, and many of you are not interested about actual engine development, but in a small scale, you can still customize these platforms in a really easy way. For example, the Godot allows you to turn normal gameplay scripts, for example, what the player might use, what the AI may use, you can turn those to editor script just by using a prefix called tool at the header of the coding editor. This makes the editor scripting and tooling and debugging really convenient because you can make these editor-specific scripts just by using the tool prefix. That example is, for example, all the nature spawning, procedural stuff, so raycasting, and it works in the editor when you just put the tool prefix on the header. Then the resources was one of the big things that I was excited about Blender when I found that, and when it comes to Godot, there's a lot of good stuff happening. There's plenty of assets. There's the so-called official Godot asset store. It's not the same as in Unity because there's license stuff required when you are running a FOSS asset store rather than commercial asset store, but there is an asset store. There's external, for example, shader libraries for Godot-specific games. There's really good plugins. There's really high-end terrain editors. There's totally customized physics engines that are really integrated with the Godot, called Godot Jolt. And there's courses, YouTube tutorials, all the good stuff. And on top of that, I also think that the engine documentation, which in most FOSS products is quite not on par for what I would want to have the engine documentation to be, but in Godot, that's actually quite extensive and well maintained. This is a kind of like personal taste issue, what you consider extensive and well maintained, but in my opinion, it is. But, once again, few buts. You heard lots of good things about FOSS engine, about Godot, and you all almost have the idea that I'm suggesting that it's the same as Unity, so why not everybody uses Godot? Well, there's a catch. These FOSS engines are obviously not as battle-tested as these commercial engines. Commercial engines, I mean Unity, Unreal, and so on. This means that large studios, big productions, and games in general have not yet really put the time, money, effort, and testing towards this engine, which means that there's lots of underlying issues hiding with these FOSS softwares. Luckily, this stuff gets ironed out over time, just like in Blender. It started rough, it started quite unfinished, but it became really promising and more polished during the years. But if you're interested what these issues are at the moment when it's not battle tested, these are my top least fun things about FOSS engines now. The Godot has quite an unpredictable file system, meaning when you handle files, whether it's 3D assets, audio files, resources, data assets, you run those through the file system which is integrated in the editor. And that's unpredictable. There's bugs, there's crashes, renaming email files, moving folders, duplicating resources can cause issues if you're not paying attention what you're doing. For example, nowadays I'm quite thoughtful about when I'm trying to move some big folders to another folder, so there's all kinds of that stuff. Luckily, even though that's the most annoying one currently, that's probably the easiest one to fix from these. Then, secondly, there's hardware and compatibility issues compared to the Unity build and compared to the Godot build. There's a lot more issues with the low-end hardware and especially legacy hardware in terms of GPUs. This can lead to graphical issues, this can lead to crashes, and so on. Then the project complexity seems to slow things down if you're making really big games. For example, if you try to make open world games with Godot, thousands and thousands of unique individual objects in the scene hierarchy, things are going to slow down, meaning all stuff slows down. Saving slows down, manipulating items, meaning nodes, slows down. But luckily, you can kind of prevent this by slicing your scenes to smaller ones and trying to have this some kind of grouping things that you can put multiple similar nodes to one node and so on. But the project complexity thing is definitely a bottleneck currently. Then the vanilla experience with these FOSS engines, meaning Godot, is not ideal for 3D, but once you get rid of that vanilla and put your own flavors to it, then it becomes ideal. For example, in Road to Vostok, when I did those initial 3D testing with the Godot, the experience was kind of not promising. But once I started to implement custom shaders, I started really tweaking out the anti-aliasing stuff. I started considering, for example, how to blend post-processing nicely, how to get nice lighting from time of day systems. Then it started to becoming more ideal. But you will need custom tooling, probably external plugins, and some level of shader knowledge for many areas. So for really beginners that are jumping into the game industry, you will get better results visually just by placing a cube and a directional light to some empty scene. That cube and directional light will look better in Unity, it will look better in Unreal, but once you tweak the Godot, then you can make the cube as good looking as in those other engines. Okay. Few closing thoughts about FOSS engines before the questions. I think there's a clear misconception that FOSS engines are only for small game jams and small hobby projects. That was my initial idea about the Godot when I heard about that first time. Like in Blender in 2012, the FOSS engines are not the industry standard, but they can do a surprisingly lot of industry standard stuff. The FOSS engine board definitely made me a better developer, because when you transition from another engine to another engine, you expose yourself to different kind of issues and problem solving that you don't get if you're just working with one specific software for your entire life. And it gave me a platform that I can fully customize for needs, meaning what I want the Road to Vostok to be built on. So my conclusion for is there's a hidden potential for FOSS game engines is that yes, there is a hidden potential, but you will need few custom shovels and some digging first. Thank you.
Thank you, Antti, for this fantastic talk. Your project is amazing.
Thanks.
You've actually been our students' choice for speakers. So
okay,
you are
that's
very
really
wanted here. I want to start with a question, like if you would now start the development of Road to Vostok with Godot, not with Unity, would it look any different?
I think it definitely would look different, because like mentioned, my whole career was working with Unity, so many of my graphical skills and engine knowledge are driven from the Unity side of things. So if I would not have that Unity experience, I would kind of struggle with some of the Godot stuff also. So I think game engines are not that you should just use one, or you should just have the knowledge of using ones. Nowadays, I think it's really important to diversify your skill sets. So having knowledge about multiple engines can actually increase your skills a lot, and you can utilize those skills kind of like transfer between the engines. So I don't think the Road to Vostok board would have gone that well and that easily if I didn't have that Unity experience.
So basically you learned things from Unity that you might have not learned if you started.
Yeah, definitely. There's so many things that you are exposed to certain problems and issues only with certain engines, because all those have different nuances. So I definitely think that having knowledge about multiple engines is a good thing.
Yeah, great. If there's any questions in the audience, right now there is one, so let's wait for the mic to come in.
Hello. Yes. Hi, Antti. Great talk. I'm actually I've followed your Road to Vostok journey since maybe you started it publicly. So really great to see you. But yeah, so for maybe a beginner, would you still would you recommend starting out with Godot, or do you think it's maybe still better to maybe start with the commercial engines, and then once you're more experienced, then maybe switch over?
Interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks first of all for following Road to Vostok. I think it totally depends on your goals, because Road to Vostok for me is kind of career-long commitment. I want to build this brand, this idea of a kind of like Finnish stalker, if you will, and this will take years and years of time. So my priorities for the game engine are it has to be stable, it has to provide me the customizability, but if your goals are you want to have quick progress, whether it's 2D in 3D, but you want to get to the, for example, the launch rather quickly, or you have some other goals that require speed and the use of all the already existing resources, then for example the Unity is probably the best choice for you, because you don't have to build those custom tools for Godot. You have that automation that is working for you with Unity. So it depends on your goals, but once again, even though if you are trying to learn and work with one engine, I think it's a good thing to take a peek another side of the fence, if you will, to look at what of those other engines are doing. Because for example, when I started making those editor scripts for Godot, I implemented some of the editor stuff that I found useful in Unity and transferred those by coding those custom made in Godot. And other way around, there's so many good stuff with Godot that Unity could take a few tips from, and you as a developer, if you have that multiple engine knowledge, you can kind of like pick the best ones from each editor and kind of have this one master editor, if you will.
So the answer is use all the engines.
Maybe not all the ones,
way.
but it depends on your goals, and it's never a good thing to, for example, take one weekend. It doesn't take that much amount of time. You don't have to spend years of trying to learn Godot. Take one weekend, watch some Godot tutorials, test it, and get some feel how it works. And you don't have to commit to that engine. Just see how it works, and you might find something that is useful even if you want to stick with Unity and so on.
Right. So I have a question. I don't actually know, like when Godot started to get a bit more popular, we had the founder talking here in the Games Now lecture series, but I don't know how the open source community of them is open. Is it possible for you to contribute to the development of Godot?
There's different, and I'm probably not the right one to answer this, but there's different, even though it's contributor based, it's not just you are pushing some GitHub thing and now it's part of Godot. There's different levels of decision making inside of the contributors, and also you have to kind of like get the most coherent features and elements and prioritize them to each version of Godot. But if, for example, I want to contribute to Godot, I can definitely do that by releasing some of the stuff that I customized. You can share those on multiple different avenues, and that's actually one of the things that I'm definitely going to do, because once I have the resources, I can hire really talented engine developers. I think that job that they will do will actually benefit the Godot development as well, because it's a win-win for all. There's no reason to kind of like hide, this is mine, this is yours. So definitely, but in terms of when Godot became popular, I think there has been this slow growth, but definitely the last year the Unity runtime feeding pushed so many eyes to Godot that it gained a quick popularity.
Spike.
But these things go up and down. But I think currently Godot is a really good place. It needs to focus on the engine development. It needs to kind of like showcase the best stuff that can be made with Godot, because there's still that misconception that Godot can't make good-looking games, even though there's much more prettier games than Road to Vostok already being produced in Godot and so on.
So you haven't yet commit to that?
Not yet.
But what would be, like if you would do something first thing tomorrow, what would be the thing that you would fix or add to Godot?
Godot is missing so-called starting templates, and that was one of those that I mentioned, that if you're a beginner, the first thing that you are going to see when you start the engine, you are going to see a cube and some sort of light.
Right.
And it's kind of intimidating to start from nothing. So, for example, Unreal does a really good job that when you start the engine test, this launch, and you can choose a template. For example, first-person template. Now you're spawned in with the FPS controller, some environments, colliders, and when you press play, you can actually move with the collider. And now you have something to start with. you might choose a racing template. Now you have a car, so you can choose a template for your idea. And FPS games are really quite complex to get right in terms of FPS controllers. So I think my first commitment would to provide some sort of universal FPS template driven from Road to Vostok. Because it's already battle tested in terms of the demo players. I think it's really well written in terms of coding. It's really modular, so it would definitely fit one of those templates.
So if you would be developing Road to Vostok engine, would that be a fork from Godot or would it be completely a standalone project, and would it still be FOSS?
I think it would be FOSS because I don't have any reason I don't gain anything from keeping this to myself. I'm quite the opposite business entrepreneur in terms of game. I have already shared assets for free to use anyone. And in terms of when I get closer to early access launch, I will definitely share more. But I think the most common way would be that I would build on top of some really stable Godot version, which is really, really stable, and then start putting those custom features on top of it, and then share those if everybody else wants to use those.
We're looking forward to that. I guess there's a question from the chat. It's quite a long one, so I'll shorten it a little bit. So do you think there will be more tools in the future that will compete or outperform other softwares?
In terms of game development tools?
I guess yes.
I think the biggest tipping point for this, meaning the popularity and the usability of these so-called alternative tools, is usually related to education. Because, for example, the Autodesk has this kind of like monopoly in game development in early years because they ruled the education system, meaning for all the students that learned about 3D modeling, they learn it through Autodesk products. But once the Autodesk was kind of like vaporized in some of the schools and the Blender came in, now the students were rolling out with Blender skills, and those students then habit the game studios, they found another studio, so the ecosystem grows quite a lot from the educational decisions. And I think you can also answer for this, but Godot has not yet all these other tools. There hasn't been this big shift that the schools are using these alternatives. We are going still with the mainstream Unities and Unreals, and that's a good thing because the industry and the jobs require that. Yeah. But once the tools becomes kind of like appealing to schools, then the kind of like the ecosystem and the snowball effect start to happen. So to answer that question, I definitely think that there will be more tools, considering, for example, there's Adobe has quite a big of monopoly in some of the areas. It would definitely need alternatives. And these are not, I'm not talking about alternatives in a way that it's something away from Adobe or Autodesk. It's actually the opposite effect, because if you have competition, the Adobe or Autodesk becomes better. If there's competition towards Unreal and Unity, the Unity and Unreal guys need to have to step up their game in order to keep the pricing models and all those things suitable for the developers.
Yeah. Any questions from the audience? Okay, so there's one in the back. Almost missed that. So let's wait for the mic.
Hi, Antti. Also been following the development of Road to Vostok for some time. Thanks for being here. I wanted to ask, since the amount of commercial games for Godot is still quite low, and the amount of first-person shooters is also low, and the amount of hardcore survival first-person shooters is very low for Godot. And I was wondering, since like you already have quite an established like audience, have you thought about perhaps that you could use that audience as maybe like leverage to like make feature requests for the Godot foundation? Because like obviously it's in their interest to support games like the one you're making. Or have you already perhaps like done something like that?
Use your power.
Yeah, really good question. I have actually contacted few people over Godot, but I think the honest answer to this is that when you're a solo developer, you are running the business side of Road to Vostok, meaning education, speaking, you are doing collaboration deals with the weapon manufacturers, gear manufacturers, you are making the game, you are doing the demos, trailers, contractor works. There's simply not time to kind of like to have this time slot for me to communicate with the engine and plan these different things out, how we could benefit from each other. So I definitely see that there's a potential for that, and I already have big list of kind of like examples for Godot contributors and developments, how Road to Vostok as a product could utilize some stuff more, and what are those key pain points, and what I think would be really important for players also, especially considering those hardware issues and so on. But I simply don't have the time currently because I'm so busy at the current Road to Vostok structure. But once the game hits early access, I hopefully have more people than just Antti, so then I can have more of this kind of stuff also.
Yeah, a lot to ask, but it will come. So what is the timeline for us to see you starting, for instance, the Road to Vostok FOSS engine development? Where, like, how far in the future is that?
I don't know. I think it's also unfair to claim something as Road to Vostok engines when it's now purely built out of Godot. But I will start that process slowly over time when the early access, and hopefully I have the resources to hire some people that I know that are really skillful. First, I'm going to fix those main issues if they are not fixed by then. Then I'm going to start building some of the kind of like the main stuff that FPS genre would benefit from Godot, and then build on top of that slowly over time. But first, I will fix the issues if the Godot has not fixed those until then, and then I will build the custom stuff. But starting right from the early access release, I will begin that engine work also.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Antti, for joining us. And